All right, so good morning and afternoon. I guess it depends on which time zone you're in. Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining Network Partners for this Brunch and Learn web event. Labeling changes included in EU MDR, what you need to know, and this is with Regulatory Affairs Manager Lindsey Folio. A few quick housekeeping items. First, we ask that you mute yourselves upon entry. Note that a colleague and myself are going to actively monitor and manually mute participants as needed. Next up, please address all your questions through the chat feature of the platform, which if you scroll your mouse a little bit, it's that little blurb looking box and it says show conversation. We'll answer those questions at the end of this presentation. And then lastly, this webinar is recorded and you'll receive the recorded presentation as well as the PDF version of the PowerPoint. So without further ado, Network Partners' Regulatory Affairs Manager, Lindsey Folio.
Thanks, Renee. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for EU MDR Labeling Changes webinar. I know there's a lot going on in the world right now, so I'm grateful you've taken the time to join us today. So as Renee said, I'm Lindsey Folio. I'm a Regulatory Affairs Manager with Network Partners, and I've been helping our clients implement changes to become compliant with EU MDR. And I have particular expertise in EU MDR and electronic instructions for use from a regulatory perspective. So the plan for today is to present some information in about 30 minutes and then leave about 15 minutes to open up for questions. And I do, fortunately, today have some of my labeling colleagues on the phone, Chris Heckert and Christy Winchester, so they'll be able to answer any labeling specific questions that you have. So without further ado, let's get into the labeling changes within EU MDR. So to start, the specific topics we're going to cover are where can I find EU MDR labeling requirements, specifically which articles and sections, and what are the major labeling changes within EU MDR. And there are a lot in there, and I'll focus on those with the potential to have the most implications to your EU MDR labeling strategy. Then we'll talk about EUDAMED a bit and what the requirements are and the current status of the database. Then I'll walk through some good EU MDR labeling questions to consider when developing your EU MDR labeling strategy. Then finally, I wanted to present Network Partners' Essential Labeling Elements tool that our team has put together. And it's really an incredible tool because it brings together global labeling requirements from over 140 countries into one simple to-read tool. So to start, we'll ask the question where. So where are the EU MDR labeling requirements? And yes, they're in EU MDR 2017-745, but more specifically, you can find them in the requirements regarding the information supplied with the device, Chapter 3, Section 23, the general obligations of manufacturers in Article 10, the cases in which obligations of manufacturers apply to importers, distributors, and other persons in Article 16, Article 18, which is that implant card section, Article 20, which is CE marking of conformity, so that has all the CE marking requirements, and then the UDI requirements in Articles 27, 28, 29, and Annex 6, and really throughout EU MDR. And it's also important to point out that there are some additional labeling requirements specified through internationally recognized standards, like ISO 15223 and EN 1041. But neither of these have been updated yet to reflect EU MDR requirements. So ISO 15223, that's currently being revised and expected to be published before the end of the year. And then EN 1041 will eventually be replaced with ISO 2417, which is still under development. And the non-harmonized symbols, which are proposed to ISO 15223, those are validated by MedTech Europe or the Sterile Barrier Association. And then some of the others will need to be explained and translated in the eIFUs if they're not harmonized. So now to get to the important piece, what are some of those labeling changes required for EU MDR? So to start, we can talk about the translations. Any text will be required to be translated in the official union language determined by the member states in which the device is made available to the user. So if you're selling your product in all EU or EEA countries, plus Switzerland and Turkey, 24 languages would actually be required. And that requirement is applicable to both IFUs and product labels. And that's why there's such a push for those harmonized symbols, because it'll reduce the amount of text that you'll need to translate. Then for the impact to marketing material, and here the notified body number is also required to be indicated in any promotional material which mentions the device fulfills the requirements for CE marking. So that's a bit of a change. And then for the changes to the product label, an MD symbol will be required to appear on the label of every device. And this recommended MD symbol that you see on the left was included in the draft of 15223, but it's yet to be finalized. And then the label should also include any warnings or precautions to be taken that need to be brought to the immediate attention of the user of the device. And this information can be kept to a minimum, with more detailed information to then appear in the instructions for use. And then if the device is supplied sterile, the label has to also include an indication of its sterile state and sterilization method. And there are some new symbols for that also in ISO 15223. And then lastly, if the device includes any hazardous substances, the presence of those substances has to be labeled on the device itself or on the packaging for each unit with a list of those substances. And then here we have an example product label. On the left is the MDD version, and then on the right is the EU MDR label. And the changes to note are first that medical device MD symbol has been added. And again, to note that that's not a harmonized symbol yet. And then item 2 is that sterile barrier symbol, which is also not yet harmonized. And this one is the one that's been included in ISO 15223 to show a single sterile barrier. And then item 3 is a 2D data matrix barcode that replaces the linear barcode. And the 2D barcode is not a specific EU MDR requirement, but it's shown to represent additional revisions to the product labels that can be made during the EU MDR transition. And then item 4 includes the web address for eIFU along with that eIFU symbol. And then continuing on to additional labeling changes within EU MDR. So there's an impact for economic operators. And here importers have to indicate their contact details on the label, packaging, or an accompanying document. And that's in Article 13. And then for manufacturers that aren't based in the EU, authorized representative information has to be included on the label. And then for changes in the clinical information category, MDR requires that additional clinical evidence to support claims. So manufacturers do not have this substantial clinical evidence and may have to change their claims, so that will affect the labeling. So it's all kind of integrated as clinical documentation updates to make sure that you're labeling any claims that you make. It's all substantiated in the clinical information. And then the IFU has to include, where applicable, links to the summary of safety and clinical performance. And then it's important to note that labeling requirements will be further specified through standards or implementing acts, as referenced in Article 8 and 9. And to note that EU MDR compliance might need to be completed prior to those ISO standards being finalized. So that could result in future labeling revisions that just need to be planned for. And then on the next few slides, I'll dive a bit deeper into the EU MDR labeling changes in the different categories of reusable surgical instruments, the implant card and patient information leaflet requirements, eIFU requirements, and then the requirements for unique device identification. So for reusable surgical instruments, they're now required to have notified body involvement and follow conformity assessment procedures. You're required to affix the CE mark and notified body number to the device unless it's not possible due to the size or nature of the device, and then it can be applied to the device packaging. And UDI has to be placed on the device and be legible after each procedure. And these requirements applicable to reusable surgical instruments are required by May 25th, 2021, which is the date of application. That was pushed out 1 year due to the COVID-19 delay. Now on to implant cards. So Article 18 has all the information on implant cards and information to be supplied to the patient with an implanted device. And here it states for an implantable device, manufacturers are required to provide information allowing the identification of the device. So the device name, serial number, lot number, UDI, any device model information, and then manufacturer information. So the name and address and website of the manufacturer. It's also required to have any warnings, precautions, or measures to be taken by the patient or healthcare professional, and any information about the expected lifetime of the device, and any information to ensure safe use of the device by the patient. And additional requirements for implant cards. So the implant card has to be stated in the language determined by the concerned member state. So from our previous slide, any text will be required to be translated into an official union language where the implant's made available to the end user. And the information on the implant card has to be readily understood by a layperson. And the implant card has to be updated where appropriate. And updates of this information can be made available through a website. And then health institutions are also required to comply with some of these requirements for providing implant cards to the patients. So they really have to work together with device manufacturers to ensure that they can complete any information on these implant cards before they give it to the patient. And a really helpful document to look at is the Medical Device Coordination Group 2019-8, the implant card guidance document, which was issued in March of this year. And it clarifies some of those items in Article 18 and provides additional information on the requirements for an information leaflet or implant card guide to be delivered with the implant card. And it's also important to note here that there are some implants that are exempted from this implant card requirement, and those are the well-established technology implants. So sutures, staples, dental filings, dental braces, etc. And also of note is that MedTech Europe has compiled a proposed expanded exemption list and submitted this to the European Commission, but is still waiting for a response on that expansion. Then on to one of my favorite topics, electronic instructions for use. So this has become a bit of a passion of mine. As I see it, it doesn't only have the potential to simplify supply chains for companies and reduce spending on paper. There are also large environmental impacts when you consider the volume and size of the eIFUs that are used in our industry. And I live out in Oregon, that's where this photo is taken, and we have trees galore. So I'm happy to help any client save a few trees if we can compliantly with eIFU. And so some requirements for electronic instructions for use in EU MDR is that electronic instructions for use have to be made available and kept up to date if the company has a website. And it's important to point out that this EU MDR requirement just says eIFUs have to be provided. It's the EU Commission regulation for eIFU, that 207-2012, that specifies the eIFU requirements if you decide you want to remove paper IFUs and just use those electronic IFUs. And this regulation specifies that if you want to go eIFU only without paper, this is only allowed for certain category of devices. So those implants and active implants and their accessories, fixed installed devices, devices with built-in systems displaying instructions, and standalone software. And it's only those devices and accessories that are intended for professional use that are eligible for eIFU without paper in the EU. And another requirement is that if you provide eIFUs in addition to paper IFUs, they have to be consistent with the content of the IFUs in paper form. So they have to match, and you have to make sure that you have procedures in place to ensure that they are the same. And then the last note is that EU MDR Article 122 gives the European Commission the option to repeal the eIFU regulation or amend its scope via an implementing act. And I know this has been in progress with pressure from industry requesting an expanded scope to include all devices intended for professional use as eIFU eligible. So this then would be more similar to the language in the US around what products are eligible for eIFU without paper. And then next on to unique device identification. And this shouldn't be too new since it's been required in the US for some years now. But specifically in the EU MDR, the UDI requirements are in Articles 27, 28, 29, and Annex 6. And at a high level, Article 27 mandates UDI rules to identify medical devices in human readable and automatic identification and data capture format. Article 28 mandates the establishment of an electronic database. And then Article 29 requires the assignment of a UDI device identifier and production identifier to medical devices, with the exception of custom devices and procedure packs. And similar to the US, that device identifier is specific to a manufacturer and a device, and a production identifier identifies the unit of device production, so a serial number, batch, or lot number. And additional requirements for UDI is that it should be placed on the label of the device in all higher levels of packaging, excluding shipping containers. It has to be used for reporting serious incidents and field safety corrective actions in accordance with Article 87. And the basic UDI device identifier has to appear on the Declaration of Conformity. And some requirements around who's required to maintain those UDI records includes manufacturers for all devices, and there's a requirement to include it in the technical documentation. For economic operators, have to keep it on record for their Class 3 implantable devices, and health institutions, again, have to keep it on file for their Class 3 implantable devices. And then lastly, in Article 60, it includes the requirement that certificates of free sale have to include that device identifier. Then on to EUDAMED, which is that European database on medical devices. And it currently exists, but access is limited to the European Commission and the competent authorities, which is really leading to some data issues since they don't have all the represented user groups in there. But the objectives of the EUDAMED database are to enhance overall transparency through better access to information, to avoid multiple reporting requirements, to enhance the coordination between member states, and to also streamline the flow of information between all the economic operators, notified bodies, member states, and the European Commission. And prior to placing a product on the market, each relevant actor will have to be registered in EUDAMED once it's been launched, and they'll get a unique registration number. And then each device also has to be registered in EUDAMED, including links to the certificates. And EUDAMED will eventually include essential technical safety and performance information for all devices. And publicly available information from EUDAMED will include incident reporting, corrective actions, periodic safety update reports, pre-market clinical investigation, as well as post-market clinical follow-ups. And the launch is currently being planned for May of 2022. So there's still a bit of time until they expect EUDAMED to be ready for all the economic operators to start entering their information. And then this is just a reference slide that lists all the sections in EU MDR that refer to the EUDAMED database, and you can really see it referenced throughout EU MDR. So it's a pretty critical part of EU MDR compliance. Okay, so then understanding all of these changes and to start or to continue thinking about your EU MDR labeling strategy, because it is mid-2020, so we're hoping you're not just starting, but we have put together some key questions to consider. So to start, have you done an EU MDR gap assessment for the information required on the product labels, as well as the instructions for use? Have you assessed the space on your product label to ensure there's room for the additional requirements, translations, and symbols? And if you don't have enough space, how do you plan on accommodating this information with a larger product label, an additional label, a country-specific label? And to reduce the amount of text requiring translation, can you use some of those recognized symbols from the harmonized standards? And are you prioritizing your reusable surgical instrument labeling updates, because these will be required by the DOA? And if you have implants, what's your strategy to provide implant cards? And if you have a website, are you prepared to provide eIFUs on that website? And do your products include any hazardous substances that would have to be identified on the labeling? And have you assessed how your EU MDR labeling changes will affect non-EU countries? Since most companies have global products, any changes that you make to the labels for EU MDR could also affect registrations globally. And then lastly, do you have UDI procedures in place? And hopefully so if you are distributing products in the US. So then just to give a little sneak peek of an internal tool our labeling and regulatory departments have developed, we call it an essential labeling elements tool, which includes 111 different labeling elements from over 146 countries. And when we say labeling elements, we mean different specific items that are included in the labeling, like barcodes or expiration dates, sterility information, legal manufacturer information, and certain symbols. And this is really a living document that we update if any regulations or standards are revised or new regulatory requirements are issued. And it's basically a mapping of all the labeling requirements for a given country. And you can see where these requirements overlap with other countries. And it can be used as a great tool to use when creating new labeling and needing to understand what the requirements are based on whatever countries you plan to market a given device. And the labeling tool contains the labeling element description and a recommended owner for each element, identification and location of the labeling element presented in the country regulation, and then it also has direct links to health authority and their regulations and labeling regulations. And then to put these EU MDR labeling changes into some context, this slide lists different projects that network partners have worked with clients on to help support their EU MDR labeling needs. So within product labels, we've created revised product labels, including additional languages, new symbols, and the eIFU web address for EU MDR compliance. For IFUs, we've evaluated newly formatted IFUs for EU MDR with a validated text verification tool to make sure the content is the same, and if there's any differences, to clearly point out what those differences are. For eIFUs, we've created eIFU procedures and style guides. We've provided training and support for compliance with the eIFU Regulation 207/2012, as well as helped companies deploy eIFUs globally. So for other countries that are able to accept eIFU without paper. And we're seeing more and more countries head in that direction. They understand the availability of technology and are moving towards accepting eIFU without paper IFUs. And we've also helped design eIFU websites and upload eIFU content. And then lastly, we've designed compliant patient implant cards for some clients. And that's all the content that I have to present on EU MDR labeling changes. And I think we have some time left for questions that I can answer from a regulatory perspective, and then we have Chris and Christy to help us answer any questions from a labeling perspective.
So, hi, Lindsey, this is Renee. First, thank you so much for that presentation. It was incredible, very informative, and thank you again for diving into these subjects with us. The first question is, out of curiosity, are hospitals and other end users still using 1D barcodes? We want to remove ours as it takes up space, but one of our customers in the EU says they still need 1D. They're requesting both, which takes up 2 times the space. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts?
Mm-hmm. I think, yeah, there's definitely players in all different levels of the supply chain that are still going to be using 1D. So I think it's a matter of understanding what your requirements are and what your user needs are through all different levels of the supply chain, and seeing what it would take to get everyone to move to 2D. And Chris, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, the 1D versus 2D.
Yeah, this is Chris Heckert, Senior Director of Labeling Solutions. It's a real mixed bag out there. You need if they're still using the red laser in any of their inventory, they won't be able to read the 2D. I'd really get a voice of the customer going to see if you can get to 2D because like you said, putting both on there with all the extra requirements is going to put a real strain on your label real estate. But try to get out to your distributors, see what most hospitals are not using the barcodes. They're usually used by the distributor network, but see if you can't get out in front of that and see if you can't find out who needs new scanners and what's preventing them from reading a 2D data matrix.
All right, thank you both. The next question, any guidance or tips regarding the FDA requirements for the symbols glossary? It would be helpful as far as incorporating the EU MDR requirements and translations. So I'm pretty sure I turned comment/question into a comment question. Does something like that exist? Any guidance or tips, again, back to FDA requirements for the symbols glossary?
And Chris, I think I'll throw that one to you as well.
Renee, could you repeat the question, please?
Sure. Okay, so I'm going to read it exactly how it is, and and you can go from there.
Thanks.
Any guidance or tips regarding the FDA requirements for a symbols glossary would be helpful as far as incorporating the EU MDR requirements and translations. So I tried to turn it into a question asking if we had any guidance or tips regarding those FDA requirements.
Okay, the FDA requirements to identify any symbology that you're using on your package that isn't supported with English language would be just to put that symbols glossary in your IFU. You're probably gonna have that symbols glossary in there anyway until all of the you're gonna have a symbols glossary in your IFU unless you're using all harmonized symbology. So I would I'm having a hard time with the question because the symbology is for EU. We put it on the label and we have the opportunity to leverage it with the FDA. I would say symbols glossary in your IFU is the way to go. And you're obviously going to have to put the English definition for those symbols. If that doesn't answer your question, please come back with define it a little better, please.
Thank you for that. Next up, please explain how the BUDI is used, and thank you.
Okay, so by that, I'm assuming you mean the basic unique UDI device identifier. And that there's a few areas like I covered where it will be used, and one most applicable to this topic is on the labeling. So included on the product label and any higher levels of packaging. And then it'll also be required to be entered in EUDAMED once that's up and running. And then on any reporting serious incidents and field safety corrective actions, you'll have to include it there. So it's very, very similar to some of those requirements around UDI in the US. So what I would recommend doing is just review any existing UDI procedures that you have in place for the US and make sure it includes any additional requirements from EU MDR. So you're covered for all the EU requirements as well. And another one is just included on the Declaration of Conformity.
Great, thank you. What does the exclamation mark in front of USA mean?
I'm not sure what that question's referring to.
Lindsay, if you look on slide 13, on the label, the symbol with USA has an exclamation point in front of it.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure what that symbol is.
Chris Hecker, are you able to answer that? And Lindsay, do you mind going back to slide 13?
Yeah, let me do that.
I'll have to see it. I'm not familiar with an exclamation. No. To be honest with you, I have never seen that before.
Yeah. And I think that's just because this was just an example label that we pulled. So I think it's just like a placeholder for a symbol and not an actual symbol.
That's good to know. If there are many levels of packaging for multi-unit packs, do all elements need to be on each level?
This is Chris Heckert. There are requirements where the within the EU MDR, there's requirements for what's got to be on the sterile packaging, and then there's requirements that has to be on the saleable package. So if you look in there, it's very clear as to what's supposed to go on the sterile barrier packaging, and then what has to go on the outer package. And what has to go on the sterile barrier package is a subset of what goes on the outer package.
Okay, the next comment is a correction, and I might butcher this, so hang with me. One correction, it's either class LRMS or class 1 RMS, sorry about that, devices were granted an extension to May 2024 in the second corrigendum. Unsure how that one said too. So just a correction, something for us to look at going forward. Is there an emergency number recognized symbol that can be used on hazmat labeling?
And Chris, are you aware of that symbol?
I'm not off the top of my head. Am I aware of a hazmat emergency number? Sorry.
That's all right. Can the eIFU be a downloadable PDF of the manual?
And it can be a downloadable PDF. You just want to make sure that everything is, you're able to read everything clearly in that eIFU version. What we have been recommending clients do is to not just use their PDF and convert it into eIFU, but to make it more of a text readable formatting. So yes, that's a possibility. But what we've seen clients do is have two different versions, one that's intended for eIFU and one that's intended for that paper IFU. Especially if you have more specific and different requirements for your eIFU versus your paper IFUs. And then it would just be a matter of making sure you are controlling them using your documentation control procedures.
And I'll piggyback on that. Everyone that we've reformatted their eIFUs, we've increased the font size from 6 point to 10 or 11 point. We use color. We format them to fit on an A4 or a letter size piece of paper to facilitate printing them. And to Lindsey's point, you don't need to make them so that they're printable or downloadable, but most people are.
Great answers. Next question, if a larger label is not an option to add more information, an additional label was mentioned, what would this mean?
Yeah, so for that, we've seen clients to address the additional language requirements on the product label, create an additional label that has some languages included. And they can either use that additional label for everywhere that it's going or only apply that label based on the destination of the product. So again, if you can't include anything on your current product label and need additional space to add that additional information. Anything to add, Chris?
No, we see this a lot. There's so many requirements now for the world that a lot of our clients are postponing some of their labeling and putting that additional country-specific label on at their distribution centers. And because they know where it's going at that point, it's specifically tailored to that destination, and that's what ends up freeing up the room.
Very good, thank you. Is the Essential Labeling Elements tool available for purchase?
And it is not, it's really an internal tool for us, but if you have a specific question or you're interested in a specific country requirements, feel free to reach out to Chris or myself and we'll talk to you about it.
And I'll mention, I'd like to mention why we can't do this. It is a tool, but because devices have so many different categories that they fall in, it's not a one-size-fits-all tool. So it would be dangerous in the hands of someone that was using it incorrectly. To Lindsay's point, if you have a question, feel free to reach out to either one of us.
Great, thank you. Do you do a translatability assessment of the English before translating it into different languages to ensure compliance? Example, to ensure the patient or user can understand it.
So my recommendation on that would be to make sure you do any of your human factors usability on your eIFU before you go ahead and translate it. Another thing we've seen with notified body review is they're letting companies just submit the English version, and then once notified body agrees with all the content, then they'll go ahead and start their translations. So to make sure you're not doing any repeat translations and not adding additional work, you want to make sure it's in a good place before you initiate those translations.
And I'm going to throw in and say this is we're entering into a world of e-publishing that we really are new to, right? A lot of our clients are struggling with the same question. At what level you've been writing your patient information? You've been writing your information for HCPs. Now it needs to be available for the patient. What grade level do you write it for, and stuff like that? We are seeing some of our clients are rationalizing a Fleisch-Kincaid grade level. And then they're writing it to that level and putting it in front of their notified bodies. But to Lindsay's point, if the notified body will approve your English version, you should be okay on your translated version.
Great. Next question. GS1 guidance suggests that BUDI does not go on packaging. Are you familiar with their guidance?
I think there's still a few questions with the buddy as EUDAMED comes up and those requirements get squared away. It'll become clearer. We are suggesting to our clients to hold off on making any BU-UDI decisions at this time. To Lindsay's point earlier, you should be aware of what they are and what implications they could cause if they go ahead as currently configured.
Next, and these are the last two, are Class 1 and 2 products required to have any clinical or adverse event statements on the eIFU?
And that one, off the top of my head, I'm not sure the difference in class with that clinical information, but we could look into it.
And then last, what methods have you seen with companies integrating patient implant cards?
We have seen, Leslie mentioned the, sorry, Lindsay, what was the guidance? It's a funny medical device guidance document from our friends at Medical Device Coordination Group, have put together a great guidance for patient implant cards. And I'm going to mention one thing that could have a big impact on your plans. What the industry, we talk to a lot of clients, what the industry is going towards is using the patient implant card, using the symbology that's in 15223, and then pointing the patient on their patient implant card to the patient information website and not putting pre-printed patient information into the package. There have been so few devices that have been cleared through EU MDR so far that we're not quite sure if this is going to be accepted by all the notified bodies, but it is definitely an industry initiative to put the patient information destination or location on the patient implant card using the the eIFU symbol with the website underneath it.
All right, and then there's one more question, so I'm going to go ahead and ask that as well. If the legal manufacturer is in the EU, but the product is made in China, do we have to include the importer symbol?
And that one, it could depend on a few things, so it's hard to answer with just that information, depending on what actually takes place in China and what actually takes place in the EU. So if you want to reach out to us directly, provide a little more information, we can help you look into that one.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Lindsay, and thank you so much, Chris. Lindsay, do you mind going forward to towards the end of this deck so we can quickly look at future webinars?
Yep.
Great, thank you. So really quick to everybody who's on the call, we have, as part of our labeling series, here are the next 3 upcoming webinars as they pertain to labeling. We have the process assessment, good, better, and best, how to expertly choose a global labeling system, and then what a global labeling system implementation really looks like, all led by Chris Heckert, who you got to know today on the call, along with Lindsey Folio. So thank you everyone for your participation today during this Brunch and Learn, and to our speaker, Lindsey Folio, and SMEs in labeling, Chris Heckert and Chris Bonifield. If you have any labeling questions or you need additional labeling help, you can always reach out to one of the Network Partners team members, and we can ensure it gets to the appropriate contact. Again, you'll receive this recorded presentation and PDF of the PowerPoint presentation. Be sure to stay in the loop and follow Network Partners on LinkedIn to access our updates and future free webinars. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your Thursday.